It has been a while since my last video. Nevertheless, I am back with what I intend to be the start of a new series on Maoism detailing its fundamentally anti-Marxist character. It is often assumed that if Mao did not develop Marxism-Leninism to a higher stage, that Mao at least offered some contributions to the general treasury of Marxist-Leninist theory. Likewise, many would assume that Stalin and Mao generally saw eye to eye on all issues of importance, and that Stalin held the victorious Chinese Revolution in high regard. But other than a few formal messages directed towards the Chinese state from Stalin, there is little to support the claim that Stalin supported the line of the Chinese Revolution, and even less is there in common between Marxism-Leninism and the theories of Mao Zedong, as we shall see. Mao's theories naturally took shape through the course of the Chinese Civil War, and one can get an estimate of from where they developed by looking at who comprised the CCP's forces and who Mao later envisioned taking part in the People's Democratic State, as well as Mao's own kulak class background. Side by side with the workers and peasants were the bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie, despite warnings from Stalin and the Comintern that the national bourgeoisie has gone over to the camp of counter-revolution, having lost contact with the broad masses of the people. Defying these warnings, Mao ultimately declared that the Chinese Revolution won victory by acting contrary to Stalin's will, and that he'd made a start in proposing our own line for construction, that is, a line distinct from that of the Bolshevik Party. Aware of the line being taken by Mao and his followers, Stalin would go on to describe the Maoists as margarine communists, and later on, by Mao's own admission, Mao came to be regarded by the international communist movement as a half-Tito or quasi-Tito, while the CCP's victory in 1949 was regarded as a victory of the Tito type. In characterizing Mao as a quasi-Tito, or the Chinese Revolution as being of the Tito type, Stalin could not have but been referring to the same mixture of Narodnik, Menshevik and Trotskyite doctrines that defined the politics of Titoite Yugoslavia, which had entered the employ of the imperialist powers and was serving much the same role as Trotsky had before World War II. And if we consider how Stalin defined Trotskyism and compare it with Mao's own words, we find that this likening of Mao to Tito, who the common form had already exposed as a Trotskyite, was no mistake. The essence of Trotskyism, writes Stalin, is first of all denial of the possibility of completely building socialism in the USSR by the efforts of the working class and peasantry of our country. What does this mean? It means that if a victorious revolution does not come to our aid in the near future, we shall have to surrender to the bourgeoisie and clear the way for a bourgeois democratic republic. Consequently, we have here the bourgeois denial of the possibility of completely building socialism in our country, disguised by revolutionary phrases about the victory of the world revolution. Of course, Mao and Tito could not repeat verbatim Trotsky's by then entirely discredited theory of permanent revolution in order to attack socialist construction in the Soviet Union, but Mao reached the same end by another avenue. For Mao, socialism is a highly contradictory phenomenon which shall always produce its own gravediggers in the form of a bureaucracy, the dictatorship of the proletariat, that would restore capitalism. Hence, in Mao's eyes, the fault for capitalist restoration in the Soviet Union lay with Stalin, who departed from Marxist-Leninist dialectics in his understanding of the laws of class struggle in socialist society. Mao explains, it cannot be denied that before Stalin's death, high salaries were already being paid to certain groups and that some cadres had already degenerated and become bourgeois elements, mirroring Trotsky's claims about the Soviet Union under Stalin degenerating into a bureaucracy which, for Trotsky, was the natural outcome of his permanent revolution not being undertaken. In other words, Mao had declared the construction of socialism in the Soviet Union a failure, necessitating the development of his new line for construction, which would overcome the problem of bureaucracy. On this question, Mao finds himself in agreement not only with Trotsky and Tito, who, like Trotsky, also described the Soviet Union as a degenerated worker state, but Bukharin and Khrushchev also. One cannot forget that Khrushchev himself, singing from the same hymn sheet, accused Stalin of formalizing party and Soviet work and of bureaucratizing the whole apparatus. The dictatorship of the proletariat is regarded by these five as a bureaucracy which, one way or another, had to be fought against, or in other words, it was an affront to the development of capitalism. Mao himself praised the selling off of the machine tractor stations by Khrushchev in the Soviet Union and the overcoming of the bureaucratism and over-centralization which Mao had associated with Stalin, many of these measures taken from Bukharin's program and adopting Bukharin's idea of the peaceful growth of the bourgeoisie into socialism. Mao, as Stalin put it, would surrender to the bourgeoisie and clear the way for a bourgeois democratic republic by rejecting the dictatorship of the proletariat as it had existed in the Soviet Union as a bureaucracy, and in the place of this promoting his new democratic state free from Stalinist over-centralization, where the bourgeoisie and kulaks would be left to grow into socialism unmolested. Stalin continues, "The essence of Trotskyism is secondly denial of the possibility of drawing the main mass of the peasantry into the work of socialist construction in the countryside. What does this mean? It means that the working class is incapable of leading the peasantry in the work of transferring the individual peasant farms to collectivist lines, that if the victory of world revolution does not come to the aid of the working class in the near future, the peasantry will restore the old bourgeois order. Consequently, we have here the bourgeois denial of the capacity or the possibility of the proletarian dictatorship to lead the peasantry to socialism, disguised by a mask of revolutionary phrases about the victory of the world revolution." On this question, Mao again does not dare openly repeat the bourgeois theory of Trotskyism that it is impossible to bring the labouring masses of the peasantry to socialism, but he nevertheless arrives at the same conclusion. For Trotsky, the proletariat would come into hostile collision with the broad masses of the peasantry with whose assistance it came into power, while Bukharin believed that the peasantry and kulaks both eventually would grow into socialism peacefully if left alone. Bukharin accused the Bolshevik Party of fostering a bureaucracy that was pursuing a policy of military feudal exploitation of the peasantry, a sentiment that would be shared by Mao, who wrote that Stalin's squeezing of the peasantry had seriously dampened the peasants' enthusiasm for production, a hostility to the leadership of the peasantry by the proletariat in the process of socialist construction. Describing the policy of the Chinese state concerning the peasantry, Mao writes that the CCP takes into account the interests of both the state and the peasants, in other words, separating the peasantry from the dictatorship of the proletariat and the alliance with the proletariat, whose interests, according to Mao and Bukharin, must always fundamentally sit outside the peasants. In this respect, where Mao and Bukharin and also Trotsky differ on paper, they only prove to be two sides of the same coin, reaching the same conclusion of opposing the leadership of the peasantry by the proletariat in socialist construction. Mao and Bukharin through opposing the bureaucracy of the proletariat leading the peasantry, and Trotsky through open hostility to the peasantry and distrust of the proletariat. Stalin concludes, "The essence of Trotskyism is lastly denial of the necessity for iron discipline in the party, recognition of freedom for factional groupings in the party, and recognition of the need to form a Trotskyist party. According to Trotskyism, the CPSUB must not be a single united militant party, but a collection of groups and factions, each with its own center, its own discipline, its own press, and so forth." What does this mean? It means proclaiming freedom for political factions in the party. It means that freedom for political groupings in the party must be followed by freedom for political parties in the country, i.e. bourgeois democracy. Consequently, we have here the recognition of freedom for factional groupings in the party right up to permitting political parties in the land of the dictatorship of the proletariat, disguised by phrases about inter-party democracy, about improving the regime in the party. That freedom for factional squabblings of groups of intellectuals is not inter-party democracy, that the widely developed self-criticism conducted by the party and the colossal activity of the masses of the party membership is real and genuine inter-party democracy, Trotskyism cannot understand. On this point, there could be no mincing of words between Trotsky and Mao. Trotsky always stood for the formation of groups with separate platforms, striving to a certain degree to segregate and create their own group discipline. To which Mao concurs that there should be a direct confrontation of competing views, organised at the local and by extension all other levels of the party, freely expressed in different factional publications. Gone is the Leninist idea that the vanguard party is built as a monolithic united organisation, replaced by the Trotskyite notion that any part of the party should be allowed to formulate its own line at variance with the national and other regional sections of the party. Mao gives further clarity with his contention that the two slogans, "Let 100 flowers bloom" and "Let 100 schools of thought contend," have no class character. The proletariat can turn them to account, and so can the bourgeoisie or others. Different classes, strata, and social groups each have their own views on what are fragrant flowers and what are poisonous weeds. Or, in other words, the ideology of different classes would be permitted to freely develop, leading, as Stalin warned, to freedom for political parties in the country, i.e., bourgeois democracy. Mao would practically say as much later on with his admission that there are representatives of the bourgeoisie in the party, which he used to justify the Cultural Revolution. As history shows, this allowance for bourgeois ideology to freely exist and freely develop inside the CCP has helped lead to the social imperialist mess that is today China. The convergence of Maoism and Trotskyism on these three defining points, although Trotskyism and Maoism represent different opportunist trends, is definitely not by coincidence. Trotskyism was long ago identified by the Bolshevik Party as a petty bourgeois deviation, and it has historically only taken root among elements of the petty bourgeoisie, like Trotsky himself, the most unstable social class. Maoism, developing from the theories of a former kulak, can claim a similar social origin, and during the Chinese Civil War, only had a hold among members of the party from a well-off or non-proletarian background, a characteristic that persists to this day when the majority of Maoist sects are made up of university students, the children of well-off petty bourgeois and bourgeois families, not all that different from the social origin of the critics of Marxism identified by Lenin in What Is to Be Done. The criticisms of Marxism and Stalin heard in universities overlap with the criticisms found in the works of Trotsky and Mao about the dogmatism, over-centralization, and so on. But, like Lenin pointed out, the new critical trend in socialism is nothing more nor less than a new variety of opportunism. And in the end, what we find is Maoism, like Trotskyism, represents another petty bourgeois trend critical of the fundamental principles of Marxism-Leninism, treating its solution of Marxism-Leninism's problems as a higher development of Marxism.